We had some good questions. I've collected some. A lot of the questions concerned very specialist things. Someone asked why we didn't have a vegan lunch. I think that's a very interesting question. And if I may summarize, a lot of the other questions articulate a feeling or a wish to discuss where to go now. We have had tremendous analyses. I think most people in this room believe that we have a really serious problem, so there are no questions in terms of what's the evidence, but rather, where do we go from here? And perhaps let me begin this debate by telling you about a fascinating case study of Cuba I read very recently. As you know, Cuba was at the receiving end of the US embargo since the Soviet Union collapsed, which meant no access to a lot of consumer goods all of us take for granted, oil shortages, etc. So in response to this, they had to program serious societal changes. They did, I think, after all the right things, all the things many of you have advocated. There was very limited pesticide use. They had to restrict their calorie intake. The average calorie intake was 1,900 per day, which meant they got slimmer. They didn't have many cars to drive. They walked more. Health increased. There was a very interesting form of gardening and horticulture. They had to start planting things without pesticide use in cities and so on and so forth. So fairly drastic changes, restrictions in what they could buy, and yet, here comes the clangor. They managed to, of course, reduce their carbon dioxide emissions, but missed the targets recommended by the International Panel on Climate Change. I'm telling this because I wonder, I think I'm not alone in wondering, can our societies, the Cuban societies probably could manage these drastic changes because of their politics and the way they're organized, but shall we begin this discourse by reflecting a little what you all think? Can our societies, the Western democracies, capitalism, are we well constructed to bring about these changes? What do you think? Where shall we start? Howard, would you like to?
Well, thank you. It's a great question. And I like that you framed the last part of it in terms of Western democracies and then gave the opportunity for the first answer to the guy who comes from the most conspicuous failure of democracy in the West in recent months. I think the answer has to be yes. So it's a question of how. Now, Cuba is a great example. If there were a health and well-being Olympics, Cuba would have outpaced the US by a wide margin. If there's a sustainability Olympics, Cuba beat the US by a wide margin. So there's a great lesson to be learned there, that the techniques that are needed are available. I didn't realize that Cuba had failed to meet IPCC targets, but one of the interesting challenges that Cuba faced was the lack of financial resources and the lack of advanced technology. Advanced technology will be part of the move toward a post-carbon economy. I demonstrated some of those with pictures of electric cars and modern communication techniques and so on. So I think Cuba struggled with a huge burden of disadvantage that many of the Western countries will not have to struggle with. It's a provocative question because China, I think, over the last 2 months has taken the lead in solar energy and in many other forms of sustainability transition. And one can't help but notice that that's a relatively centralized political system. Yeah. At the same time we've seen that happen, we've seen the democracies come to some pretty bad decisions. So it is a challenge. I think what that means for us, this kind of goes back to Mary's talk, that we need to be communicating well and training the next generation of leaders well enough that we are qualified to manage our democracies. And that means to be making thoughtful decisions in the face of complexity. So in some ways, the responsibility comes back to those of us who are institutional leaders in democracies to bring these problems to the public, to portray them in ways that people can understand and engage constructively, and to train the next generation to make the decisions so that we combine the best of Cuba with the best of China with the best of Europe.
Thank you very much. Shall we, if you like this question, shall we go around? What your thoughts are?
Yeah, it's a very fundamental and challenging question to which there is no easy answer, but I think that what is clear is in our own societies we're seeing the limits to our own democracy, and indeed one could argue that some of the problems that have been experienced in the US recently, perhaps in the UK, have been due to very powerful vested interests, which have to some extent manipulated public opinion, manipulated the agenda. So I guess we who pride ourselves in living in democracies need to ask ourselves whether we truly do live in a democracy and how we can make that democracy function better. And I think the scientific community has a very important role in that. Can we help to immunize people against fake news, against fake science and so on? We haven't done a very good job of that so far. Maybe we as scientists, research community, need to step out of our comfort zone and communicate better with the general public about how we come to the conclusions that we come to. What do we mean by evidence? How do we go about getting that evidence? How do we sift out the poor, weak evidence from the stronger evidence? So I think there's a big role for the scientific, in its very broad sense, the scientific community, social sciences, the whole range and the whole panoply of sciences, I think, have a role to play in that, and we certainly can't be complacent. I think where we have seen advances is in the energy sector. So, for example, if you look at the UK, we are moving along with decarbonising our energy sector, but what we're not doing is we're not addressing the transport sector and we're not addressing food and agriculture in any kind of meaningful way. And I think one of the reasons for that is that most of us don't really care where we get our energy from as long as it's reliable and it's reasonably priced. I think many people don't like the idea of being restricted in terms of their transport patterns, although you could argue that we could create a much more mobile society at much lower environmental impact if we didn't all insist on having our own private car, for example, if we had a better planned transport system. And maybe disruptive technologies will have some role to play. Maybe, autonomous vehicles, for example, in the future will allow us to use our limited resources more efficiently. So I guess part of the trick is trying to nurture and foster disruptive technologies which can radically reduce our environmental impact, but perhaps without, at this stage, radically reducing our capacity for freedom, because I think we tend to interpret personal freedom often as the freedom to consume, but that's only one element of our personal freedom. And I think we may have to give a little bit on the freedom to consume in order to retain some of the other freedoms, like the freedom for future generations to be able to enjoy what we have enjoyed in terms of the Earth's resources. And I just conclude by saying that I think there's two elements to this, really. One is the actual increasing efficiency, and the other is actually capping environmental effects. And you actually need to do both. If you just increase efficiency, by and large, which is an approach that's been very widely used, unless you actually have a cap on resources, you actually just end up by using more, because you're more efficient, the resources cost less, so we then start to accumulate more of them. And it seems to me that one of the tricks of government policy is to combine improved efficiency, dramatic improvements in efficiency, with abatement, so with capping the absolute level of resource use. And that seems to me an argument that we need to be making with the political leaders. And I would just close by saying that, the idea of a political leader is a bit of an oxymoron. I mean, politicians don't lead. They don't lead thought, They follow, and they will follow where they think the public will accept.
Strongly and stably.
Strongly and stably, yeah.
Juliette.
Yeah, I've often thought about some of the words that Andy said this morning in response to the question about global population increase, and you repeated it just now, actually. Yes, the global population is increasing, and that's a huge burden on the environment, but the way that we consume is also such a big burden on the environment, and probably much more the way that some of us consume compared to others. And I guess the point I would have made is very similar to what you just said, Andy, that can we think about our consumption patterns? Can we think about our behavior? And I think we can. I think one of you made a comment this morning about GDP not being the way that we need to judge our happiness and our economic growth as GDP isn't only our way of feeling happy and healthy. So we need new ways of thinking about what makes us happy and a clean environment is what makes us happy. Going out into a green space makes us happy, not necessarily having X amount of cars. So that's where I would I'm very in admiration of Cuba in that way, but also I'm a realist that we can change some of our consumption patterns, and we will have to, and that's maybe not in line with the capitalist train of thought.
I think it's just adding to that. I think they can probably hear me.
Are you still
This might still be on, I don't know. Otherwise I have to lean over your microphone. Oh, is that better? Oh yes. Well, that was good, wasn't it? So what I was going to... When Juliet said that, if she thinks we can think about our patterns of consumption, and I think, yes, that's our job. But I guess I was thinking when she said that in general, the general public don't think, or they don't want to think about. So, when they go, and I remember the sort of recycling of your rubbish, your household rubbish, for example. Nobody actually would think about what to do. I mean, myself included, actually. It was the transition to having, I think we've got 4 bins in the utility now. That took a long time. Because in general, you're not thinking when you're doing it. I mean, I am actually consciously thinking now, but the rest of my family are not really. I think, and I think we have to be honest about, where the general public is, and part of it's that we all have different values and different rules by which we live. And part of it's, I think, the busyness of society, running from one thing to the next, and something that is just, that's this throwaway society, consumptive society. And so that's, I guess, one comment. We have to facilitate it being easy for people to change behaviour, and/or we have to influence governments to enforce policy and taxes and associated taxes and things that ensure that people have to, or they're incentivised to. And I think that, my own experience with changing policy, which Andreas will share, in relation to chemicals, is, some of it we've managed to do quite fast, maybe within 10 years.
That's fast.
That's
yes.
fast.
Yeah.
On average, it takes 50 to 100 or even longer years. And that's because we don't seem to learn from lessons of the past, when actually there is a threat or something like planetary health that's actually been is being raised to the fore, and actually nobody's questioning necessarily the evidence. Doesn't mean we do anything about it, which I think it was a point either Andy or Howie did make. So I think learning from the past would be a good thing for our policymakers to actually embrace. But I also think that that we need to help them with that. I think many of these, a problem like planetary health, it's multifactorial. And so it's going to require decision-making tools and policies that embrace that multifactorial nature of it. So I don't think it's going to be simple.
No. Mary.
Okay. I think the key is, from what, and I'm picking up from what you said already, is about an educated citizen, or educated citizenship. which touches upon all things. But I wouldn't lay all the burden on saying, well, it's up to the scientific community to be doing this, because I think we all as citizens need to be doing that. And if we do have an opportunity in the higher education sector, because you've got 18-year-olds, that's the first time they've left home, we have an opportunity to change habits, the sorts of things you've been referring to develop an environment which models the sorts of behaviours and the sorts of approaches that we might expect them to take once they graduate. So again, it goes back to that thing of what you've already said and you've reiterated, but educated citizenship, but not just for the scientists, but for all people to be more knowledgeable, and not cutting people off and saying, well, okay, you're in one box. You do this sort of thing. I'm a theatre person notionally, but so I can't understand the rest of it. Whereas actually what tends to happen is when a scientific project needs some public engagement activity, then they start coming and knocking on the doors of colleagues of mine, because they think, well, let's get some people who can communicate to come along and. So I think it goes back to that thing of thinking about the broader person, about the citizen as a whole.
But if I may add briefly, I think I want to open to everyone else if this is okay with you. My experience comes mostly with the chemical industry and arguing with them, and often I find that there are limits to communication, science communication in particular, and often it's not a scientific debate anymore when it then comes to curtailing their chemical production, or when they feel some of their chemicals in their portfolio are threatened. They are protecting their portfolio, and all of a sudden it's not a scientific debate anymore, it's not a scientific discourse. I'd like to open it up to the audience.
Hello, first I'd like to thank all the speakers for an absolutely brilliant day. So many things to think about. But one of the things that we were thought about today and heard about was the rising population across our planet. And one of the questions I want to ask or get your views on is that large areas of those rising populations, due to the triumph of modern medicine, are people surviving into decades of life that they wouldn't be surviving into in previous times. So for many of our societies, we have an aging population who have accumulated health insults or disabilities along the way, and their consumer needs are quite different to maybe other types of population. We heard today about the use of heating and air conditioning, and that would be an obvious one where older people's needs may be rather different to younger people's needs. And I wonder what your perspective is and how we face these challenges with very large numbers of aging populations, not just in our Western societies, but also in other societies that have gone through their development of modern technologies. Thank you.
Maybe one of you answers? Feels like it.
Well, shall I have a crack at that? That's a very important and difficult question to answer. But, I mean, population growth as such now, as Alex Eze said, I mean, the main population growth, the main focus of population growth is actually in Africa. But you're quite right that, of course, around the world, people are living much longer. And to some extent, there is an increase in life, the length of life, without necessarily an increase in improvement in the quality of life, particularly towards the end. So, and one of the challenges is, of course, some of these determinants of ill health in old age are, of course, environmental. So the fact that we're exposed to too much air pollution, or we have too sedentary a lifestyle, or whatever it is partly determining whether we have a healthy old age. And of course, increasingly, we will need to think about concepts like retirement, which were designed really for an age when people perhaps only lived 5 years or so after stopping work. So the idea now of someone retiring at 65 and not doing anything productive is increasingly, I think, outmoded. And so we do need to think more of a kind of life course approach. What things can people do that give them pleasure and hopefully are also productive in the different stages of their life? And I think we will see older people being engaged much longer, hopefully, if their health holds out. In terms of the environmental impact, it is obviously true that the longer you live, you are going to have an increasing environmental impacts, but certainly towards above the age of 80 or so, per capita greenhouse gas emissions, based on the evidence we have, do tend to decline somewhat, because people are much less using their cars, they're using their air travel much less, and so on. So again, we need to think about ways of looking after the elderly population, but reducing the environmental footprint of doing so. And I think there's going to be a lot of interest, for example, in housing, purpose-built housing for the elderly, which is also low energy. Many of the dietary changes, nutritional changes we would like to see are also healthy diets, but they're also lower environmental impact diets. So I think there are win-win strategies that we could put in place if there was a political will to do so.
Yeah, I often think that the issue of aging is framed in a negative way. I personally delude myself into thinking that there's a lot of benefits to aging, don't you think?
Yes.
Some benefits. Let's not overstate them.
I'll just add one thought to that, if I could. This could be a long discussion, and I'll be very brief, but one of the experiences that we're all living through now is the transformation technologically of an industrial society to a post-industrial society, and increasingly the replacement of humans with machines for routine tasks that can be programmed and carried out effectively by machines. Not just manufacturing, but driving vehicles, reading x-rays, searching legal documents. I mean, many, many tasks are being replaced. Human jobs are being replaced. That means a forecast surplus of workforce. We don't have any plans for replacing the people who will be thrown out of jobs. But one sector in which machines can't replace humans is caring. And so it may be that in decades to come we see a shift of employment from conventional routine jobs that machines take over from people to more caring for elders. So at the very end of life, there may be a rebalancing that goes on. It may actually be good that we have less need for people to make widgets and carry out tasks, because we sure have more need for people to care for elders who need caring. But shifting from the role of elders as people who need caring, elders are also a tremendous resource. There's a form of legacy thinking that goes on as you approach late in life. Elders, we know from psychologist Erik Erikson and others that the legacy phase of life, where people think about what comes after them, they think about what they'll be leaving for next generations, begins in the 50s and 60s and continues. I don't think any of us have used the conceptual and political power of elders to help achieve the transformation we need in addressing climate change and in moving to a post-carbon economy. But one of the great sources of that energy ought to be in the aging population.
Most of you know that the plastic bag tax has changed people's habits. In other words, that we have a better planet because they're not using so many plastic bags. So my question is quite simple to the panel. What's the easy win for the equivalent of the plastic bag tax, which would crucially change people's habits for the better?
Yeah, please. Do you want to just butt in?
I would just say carbon tax. I mean, put $100 a ton. I mean, Nick Stern has just come out, I think reiterated with Stiglitz, two very eminent economists have just come out saying what we need is a universal carbon tax. The problem is it makes eminent sense, because you could just transfer you don't have to increase taxes overall, as I said this morning. You put the tax on these on resources that are causing major ill effects, and that will rebalance the economy. The problem, of course, is that there's a massive opposition to doing so from interests that are making their profits. The whole business model is based on not paying the full economic costs. So they're not going to, just as the point you made about the chemical industry, they're not going to give up easily. And that's, of course, one of the reasons that we're seeing the pushback in the States at the moment. So I suppose it then becomes a political question, not a technical one. How do you actually implement a carbon tax like that? And I think there are ways of doing it. There are countries that have done it. Sweden has done it. It's got a carbon tax of well over $100 a ton. Hasn't damaged its economy. Its economy is doing well. So it's really trying to, I think if politicians made the case to the public, we're not going to increase your taxes overall, we're going to shift them. And this is why we're going to do it. I think the public would agree. I don't think there'd be a big debate. The problem is they're not doing it. The left or the right are not doing it. And it seems to me that we need to keep making that case very strongly.
Perhaps, if I may, the relatively quick fix for pollution might be the way that Europe has been dealing with chemical regulations in the last 10 years. And that is putting the onus on the health effects of the chemicals they're producing on the manufacturer. So you might not believe this, but in many countries in the world, industries can release any chemicals into the environment without any sort of information on what that chemical could do, how persistent it is, what organisms it might affect. Europe is really the world's leader when it comes to chemical regulation. So if the United States and other countries, China, Asia, would all take this policy on board, I think that would be very, very useful.
Oh, that's my hearing aid, sorry. I am one of these elders, as you put it. I was brought up during the war. And because of that, I'm terribly interested in recycling. When they introduced recycling in Hillingdon, I happened to be one of the councillors. The only way that they were persuaded to offer a good recycling service was threats of fines if they didn't set it up in a particular way. They had to actually introduce a certain percentage of stuff that was recycled as opposed to general waste. And so I think it was Europe, said that if you didn't produce those figures, and they went on till the 2020s and 2025, they would have very heavy fines, and that forced them to change, and I think it's very good. The same with the plastic bags. It wasn't that we were all so wonderfully good, it was because we'd have to pay 5p for every bag. In other words, it was threats. It wasn't actually goodwill. So you've got to actually persuade governments to produce these monetary threats to change people's behaviour. I mean, I'm really interested in the question of the plastic bottles. I mean, I've just been on holiday to a very hot country, to Venice, and everybody was walking around with a plastic bottle. I went to this film that you had at Brunel a few weeks ago on the ocean, where it's evidently filled with little tiny bits of plastic that the fish eat. And now, because I'm older, I eat more fish, and my God, I presume I'm just rolling around in little bits of plastic. How do we stop all this? That's not really a question, it's a comment, but it is a comment that I don't think goodwill produces many changes. You've actually got to make rules, regulations, and monetary threats.
I'm so grateful you say this, and yet this plastic bag law is so badly implemented in the UK. I go to my corner shop, they still dish out the plastic bags, and when I tell them, well, I don't want one, in the year 2030 there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish, they look at me as if I've just sung the Swedish national anthem.
I have to agree with you completely that there is a role for regulation.
Yes.
There's also a role for non-regulatory behavior modifications, nudges. In fact, going through the lunch line today, a few of us were speculating that if the vegetarian options had been first on the line instead of last on the line, we might have seen a rebalancing of what people chose to eat. We know that this works for high-efficiency light bulbs on displays in supermarkets. So that's not compulsion, that's nudging and suggestion. And then there's yet another set of tactics that have to do with social marketing and behavior change, making certain behaviors cool and popular and easy without deliberately influencing people's behaviors, but just making it the easy thing to do, and people default into the easy thing to do. So I think there's a whole portfolio of ways to bring about behavior change and policy change. And what the art that we need to access is knowing which strategy to use in which situation, to evaluate systematically the impact that we're having, and to make mid-course corrections if we need to, until we begin to see the reductions in emissions and and a more sustainable lifestyle.
I think to add to that, I think there is yes another. I think it's there is a role for you, the public, us, as well, in actually because I think it would be wrong to say that because there is a lot of power there's a lot of consumer power, or shall I say anti-consumer power. So one of the best examples of that was an endocrine disrupting chemical that has been like the poster child of endocrine disrupting, if you like, which is a chemical called bisphenol A. And you would have argued that, or we could have argued that compared with some of the other chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, which we have evidence for health effects associated with exposure to those chemicals, at the time that there was a removal of that chemical from babies' bottles and a ban on that chemical in some parts of the world, there wasn't as much evidence. But what there was a huge anti-consumer. There was the public saying, I don't want to buy that. I'm not buying that. So, I just wanted to say that because I think it's an important thing that we can actually enact change if enough of us collectively choose to.
Hi. Following on from that question, Mary alluded earlier to the students on the new course being leaders maybe in sort of promoting planetary health, and I wonder whether 18 is a bit too late. And I think maybe we should be going out to our younger children. When we saw the Plastic Oceans film, the producer talked about when she'd been to 4- and 5-year-olds, and she found that the most powerful time when they had seen the film about the oceans, and maybe that's the generation we should be concentrating on in order to affect change.
I agree with you that, perhaps 18 is already too late. They've already decided it's over by that stage. And actually, while we wouldn't be targeting quite so early 4- or 5-year-olds, so certainly the plan is to have people going out to the feeder schools that we already have existing relationships with at the sort of 12 to 14 age group, sort of putting it on the radar there, getting them to think about it early on before they're actually making some of these key decisions about which subject choices they're going to be making. Yes, I mean, yes, in an ideal world, you'd be going right back to when they're those early formative years. But in the higher education, which goes back to that whole kind of thing about the starting point for all these sorts of conversations. But certainly, we'll be moving it back to 12 to 14-year-olds at least, with the idea of planting a seed, if you like.
If I may add, if I may, with my 11-year-old daughter, who's probably watching, hi Diana, has to choose her environmental issue that she has to research. And I keep asking her, can I help you? Can I help you? So just to say that I'm really impressed that actually kids nowadays are hearing a lot about environmental issues, and they're excited and interested. So really we have to, maybe it's not even a question of going in and telling them about it, but keeping this excitement going.
Because I think when you do frame it up in terms of the big picture, that is exciting to right the way through the teenage years, and it does give them something to aim for.
Just a question to everyone. We have precisely 47 seconds to go. I first need to ask the panel. I'm personally quite enjoying myself, so I wouldn't mind carrying on a bit, and then I have to ask the audience what they feel, or what do you think, people, panel? Have you had enough, or shall we?
Actually, I think we might ask Professor George, who's been very, very, very patient all day long. We're so excited to hear your closing remarks, Andrew. Will you be willing to wait? Well, no, come. Maybe you're in my hands. Oh wow! Well, I really love this new program.
Well, come down then. In that case,
I think we should move ahead with the program.
Yeah, with the close. Yes. Okay then. In which case, I'd like to thank you. Oh, sorry, that's my time. Sorry. I'd like to thank you, panel. This was thoroughly enjoyable and enlightening, and I think that this was a really worthwhile discussion to have. And I'd like to ask to thank very much the audience for their participation and interesting question. And let's give everyone a hand.